This is Look West, a podcast from California's Assembly Democrats.
We've all seen these things with our own two eyes. I saw it as recently as 4 days ago in San Francisco. Right in front of me, a retail theft, a confrontation with the security guy going over the counter, ripping off some prescriptions, and I went and saw it, and I asked some questions, so we've all seen it.
That's Assemblymember Kevin McCarty speaking during the first hearing of the new Select Committee on Retail Theft. Hi, I'm Emily Weber with Look West. Even if you haven't seen one of these crimes yourself, videos of smash and grab robberies seem to be everywhere lately. The often grainy black and white surveillance videos or shaky cell phone videos of groups of people ransacking and robbing a store have grabbed everyone's attention.
This is an absolutely top-of-mind issue that we hear about from constituents almost on a daily basis. I think that in all parts of the state, we've seen retail theft soaring, and it's time for us to take back our shopping centers, our downtowns, and small businesses.
That's Assemblymember Cotty Petrie-Norris. The new Select Committee on Retail Theft is chaired by Assemblymember Rick Chavez Zbur. He says those viral videos we see and the retail theft statistics we hear don't tell the whole story. So he sat down with Look West to give us the whole story. Thank you for joining us on Look West.
Thank you for having me.
So, this is a brand new committee that was created by the Speaker. With the fact that you're also the Democratic Caucus Chair, what motivated you personally to take on this chairmanship?
My district is one of the districts that's most heavily hit by retail crime. And in fact, when we were putting together the Select Committee, I know one of the things the Speaker asked was to make sure that we actually had not only members from both parties, but also that we actually had folks that represented some of the areas that are hardest hit. So when you look at the statistics, Los Angeles has the highest rate of commercial robbery, which is commercial theft with the use of force of any county in the state. And of course, it's the largest county in the state, so we actually have probably the highest numbers of all of those, but the rates are particularly high. Other areas that are high are obviously in San Francisco. Kern and Fresno counties have the highest rates of commercial burglary. And then the areas where we've seen the highest rates of increases compared to the pre-pandemic areas were Fresno, Alameda, and Orange counties. And Orange County, I think, had a 50% increase. So we made sure that we actually had representatives from all of those areas serving on the committee.
That's great. And you mentioned it's a bipartisan committee. I think that shows that this is obviously a very serious issue that both sides of the spectrum are concerned about. Can you talk a little bit more on why or what your hopes are for having this be a bipartisan committee and why that would be important?
Well, I think it's important that we hear from everyone and that we take all perspectives into account and that we test them all, that we don't just assume that the lore that's out there is true, that we look at the data and we listen to all the perspectives. If we don't do that, then I don't think that we're going to come to the right place to serve the public. There are some folks out there that blame all of this on Prop 47, and then there's others that question whether or not the amount of crime is increasing as much as I think we all perceive it to be. And so we're going to get underneath all those numbers. But there, even with the lack of the areas where we do have lack of data, the thing that I focus on is the fact that even though we may not have as much data from individual retailers, we see what's going on in our communities. We see the smash and grabs. We see them. They're happening more frequently. Even in areas where we've had fewer smash and grabs, we see our CVS's and the Targets and Home Depots, we see more and more of the store being locked up. A retailer does not have a financial incentive to spend that kind of money if there's not a problem.
Right.
And to endure the shopper inconvenience and the shopper anger and fear that locking up the entire store results in. So, my view is really, what is it that it's going to, what has changed? And what is it that we need to do to really address this problem and show that we're doing something meaningful to to bring this down. I mean, my constituents look at this and they're fearful of a lot of things. They're nervous about the smash and grabs and about coming to retail establishments, and that actually harms not only the retail establishments but our neighborhoods. If people become fearful of going to their neighborhood retailer, what do? They go online and then they start purchasing there. And the ironic thing is, in some cases, when they're purchasing things online, they may be purchasing something that was actually stolen through retail theft. So we have to figure out how to address these things, and really how to figure out what the root causes are and what it is that we need to do to really stem this growing problem.
Well, thank you. That was, you brought up a couple good points that I'd like to circle back to. You mentioned specifically online resellers, places like Facebook Marketplace. I know I personally have seen, listings that look a little fishy. Is that part of the problem that we're seeing here?
I think so. And we're going to be, at one of the upcoming hearings, we're going to be spending more time delving into that. I was talking to one of the major retailers, a couple months ago. I've met with almost all of them now, and, had mentioned that, I had been in one of the stores, and that, all of the, it was a body washes were all locked up. And so I ended up ordering some of these online. And when it arrived, it was these bottles that were sort of all beat up and sort of half leaking. Wow. And the retailers basically said, you probably bought something that was actually stolen from us and being fenced online. So I think focusing on what kind of additional precautions we should be taking and protections. There was some federal legislation that required some more transparency, but there really are not consequences when people are actually, taking what they know is stolen goods and selling them online. Right. And so I think looking at what we need to do to beef that up and stop the demand for these goods. I mean, part of, I think, addressing this is really stopping the demand for the fenced goods. Mm-hmm.
That's a really great point. Business owners aren't only, like you mentioned, are not the only people that are affected by retail theft. Employees are also affected, coming to work and being worried for things that might happen. Can you talk a little bit more about the effect that you might have heard personally from these employees or business owners alike?
So first of all, employees, right, we've got real concerns that they have about being on the front lines here. And in most cases, at least the major retailers are not asking employees to intervene when retail theft is happening out of concern for employee safety, and they shouldn't be asking them to do that. On the other hand, given enforcement criterion in many of our larger cities, stealing shampoo, even at levels that are, several $100s, is not the highest priority for law enforcement to react to. So what's happening is you have people coming into the stores, basically taking materials. If there's a security guard and the person doesn't look dangerous, they may intervene. If they call the law enforcement, generally they won't respond, so they'll issue sort of a trespass ticket and ask them not to come back, and that's really the full consequence. And so I think figuring out what we need to do to make sure that there's a consequence for this is an important thing. We want to learn from our lessons in the past. We don't want to be putting people in jail and in prison for stealing small amounts of items. Right. But on the other hand, if there's no consequence and people think that they can just walk into a store and walk out with microwaves and baby shampoo and nothing's going to happen, then it does result in this building on itself. So we have to figure out what the intervention is and what we do in between to make sure that there's some kind of consequence. There's all kinds of studies out there that the criminal justice reform advocates have provided, and it's something that we know is accurate. The research is sound, which is increasing penalties, putting people in prison for long periods of time for minor things doesn't generally provide increases in deterrence. Right. What does provide increases in deterrence is the certainty and the likelihood that you're going to get caught and that there's some consequence. Mm-hmm. So I sort of look at this and I say, what can we learn from other areas where we have people generally abiding by our laws that we don't put people in jail or prison for? I mean, we have all kinds of traffic offenses that are out there, right? Right. And we don't put people in prison for speeding tickets or making a making a right-hand turn without a signal. But generally, people obey the traffic laws because there's enough enforcement out there that they know that if they're stopped, that there's going to be a consequence. They're going to have to go to a courthouse. They're going to have to pay a fine. They have that whole enforcement apparatus that's sort of out there. And it's sort of, my question is, what can we do that is comparable, that results in there being a consequence that people know that they are likely to be apprehended, and that there's a consequence for all of this, so that we can sort of stem this growing trend.
Speaking of it being growing, is retail theft growing everywhere, or really just how bad is this problem?
So it depends on the statistics, and I think that's where we see statistics that conflict, right? We see growing rates of commercial robbery in some areas. In my area, it's growing, and that's theft with the use of force. There are some counties where petty shoplifting is actually, the statistics have gone down. But the question I have on that is, are they going down because no one is apprehending them? Right. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening less. Mm-hmm. And what counters that is the fact that retailers are doing more to lock up goods, and spending more money on enforcement and on the things that they feel they need to do to try to prevent that. It's a fair question about how much it's growing. I think the thing we need to be doing is looking at, so what are some of the other, what's happening in other states where we haven't had as much of a growth in retail crime? What's happening in some of the areas in California? We have some areas in California that it's not as bad of a problem as we have in others. And so I have some questions about that I think need to be answered, but I think we need to focus on, okay, what is it that's really going to stop this?
We kind of talked a little bit about maybe some alternatives to specifically like incarceration. Are these going to be looked at by the committee in specific ways, or is there kind of approaches that you plan to use the data that you're talking about to kind of get to the deep root of this issue and find those alternatives?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to look at are basically programs that, diversion programs where if someone is apprehended for shoplifting or commercial robbery or commercial theft, and we're looking at sort of root causes. Is it due to poverty? Is it due to substance use? Is it due, what are the reasons for that? And are there ways in which we can use our enforcement mechanisms to really get people sort of the help that they need? Mm-hmm. In other cases, I think we just have lawlessness. And in those cases, I think it's a different set of circumstances. But the goal of this committee is not to roll back all the criminal justice reforms that we've had and experienced that have been good over the last 15 years. A lot of the reforms that have taken place have been good ones, where we actually have resulted in reductions in crime, where we've had people that actually are able to sort of get on a path to success in their lives, and in which we've reduced, prison terms where it doesn't really have an effect on crime. So I think we want to be very measured in how we do this and really look at, okay, what are the things that we're going to do to be able to reduce this. I personally think that where we need to be focusing on is, one, looking at diversion programs, two, looking at reducing the demand for the goods and closing off the fencing operations, and then third, looking at how we enhance enforcement of misdemeanor crimes. A lot of the issues around Prop 47 have to do with, okay, when we move the felony up to $950, is that what's causing this? I don't believe that it is, because, if you look at our felony limit, it's one of the lowest in the country. Texas has a felony limit of $2,500. I think the reason is because, something doesn't have to be a felony for you to actually take enforcement action and have a consequence. You can, we actually have prison terms that are up to a jail term for up to 6 months for misdemeanor shoplifting. It's so there are consequences. that are out there that are not being used.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for explaining that. As somebody who doesn't really know anything about Prop 47, I appreciate the explanation there. The Select Committee's had one hearing. One of the main takeaways seemed to be the need for better data. Will that be one of your main focuses for this committee? And
it will. We'll continue to look for data. I mean, and there's not no data. I just want to say that. I think one of the things that sort of came across because of what some of the witnesses said was that somehow there's no data. No, there's data out there. It's just that it is not as what many of the retailers have not done is released individualized data for their own stores and companies, because that data is essentially competitive data.
Right.
But I think we've talked to the retailers. I think that there's ways in which that data can be provided that doesn't risk competitive dynamics. And we will be focusing on trying to provide better data that's out there. I think we'll also look at, there's also ways in which we can ask them for what they're spending on additional expenditures to combat retail theft. We can look at data, how many stores are actually now locking things up versus those that aren't. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can sort of look at it to identify, the extent to which we actually, we have a problem.
I think a lot of this is perception as well. So would you say that the perception that retail theft is kind of exploding, is that accurate, or is that really just kind of like a county by county, city by city kind of thing?
I think the perception is accurate. I think the public's perception is that it is. I mean, when you walk into almost every drugstore, every big box store, every retailer, and big segments are locked up, it's hard to not come away with a perception that things are a lot worse. But one of the things I also understand is that, even sort of some of the data that's out there has shown that they have these shrinkage rates, and that includes losses for a lot of reasons. It can include shoplifting and theft. It could be employee losses. It could be just losses that happen to their inventory. But nationally, the shrinkage rates have been going up gradually. They're significantly higher in some areas. I've been told in my district in Hollywood that there are some areas where they believe that the shrinkage rates are over 25%. That is a huge number.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about this area, because if we actually end up having all of the major retailers pull out of areas of Hollywood, we're going to end up having boarded up shopping centers. That results in not only loss of jobs for the employees that are there, it means that, once a major retailer pulls out, you're not going to have other major retailers coming in. So it changes the whole character of that. It leads to blight in the neighborhood, and then the neighborhood around it ends up being impacted.
So, there's we hear from so many people, so many different consumers, that they are anxious to go to these stores because they don't really know what's going to happen when they come there. Is that something that you face or find yourself fearing as well, or facing a little bit?
I personally don't. I'm not fearful of something happening while I'm there that I think is going to result in sort of, risk to my personal safety. But I do say that the shopper inconvenience for me is a high one. When you sort of are living a busy life and you've got to stop by 5 cases and add 5 minutes 3 or 4 times in a store, you're adding 20 minutes onto onto your sort of shopping experience. But when you're also standing before a number of locked cases, I can see why people who have different risk tolerances would feel uncomfortable about that.
Sure.
So, it's something that we know that the public is demanding that we solve. And I think the Speaker Rivas, the members of the committee, I think members of the committee on both sides of the aisle are committed to doing our very, very best to do some things that will have a meaningful impact on it.
Well, going forward, it sounds like the committee has a lot on the agenda.
I think we're going to try to do at least 2 more hearings.
Okay.
There are some substantive areas that we weren't able to focus on because of just the limited amount of time in the first hearing. One of the things that we also want to talk about is what the role of poverty is in this area. We want to look at some of the longer term causes of theft and crime as part of that view. We want to look at the areas of fencing, both online as well as the fact that we know that there are areas in certain communities where you have sort of hubs of distribution channels that we want to slow down. And then I think we want to get the perspective of people locally, what they're experiencing, and then I think also what the challenges are at the local level from both our law enforcement partners as well as our retailers and our workers, really at the local level, sort of what do they perceive the causes being, and do they have things that they think we should be looking at to address this problem?
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Assemblymember Zbur, for joining us.
You're welcome.
I'm Emily Weber, and this has been Look West. And thank you for listening to this episode of Look West. Listen for a new episode of Look West on the third Thursday of each month.
The Look West podcast is produced by California Assembly Democrats. When you think of Californian politics, remember to look west.